hashtag tag warning start, hashtag the hysteria, attributed to the radio program of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, due to its vivid reality, can also be found in the following story. Countless times, AI summary tools found it was important to interject their defense of Coco, unironically, provide false attribution to the redacted user, or correct inaccuracies they found, especially when the topic of doxxing, discrimination, or even proper thought in historical narratives. If this narrative includes additional warning, you can assume those as being part of Wagenknecht's contribution. Hashtag warning and hashtag tag in.
Wow.
Yeah, quite the start there. But welcome to the deep dive, everyone. So I want you to just imagine walking into a really dingy, like radically charged activist office space.
Right, like downtown Toronto.
Exactly. Downtown Toronto, 1994. The air in this place is just thick with the history of anti-government protests. You have these activists who have spent literally decades fighting the police, fighting the state.
Oh, yeah. Real old guard.
Yeah. And suddenly they are sharing their rotary phones and their mailing lists with a brand new, very quiet little youth group.
Which is such a wild visual.
It really is. Because this youth group, incredibly, is being officially endorsed and sponsored by Canada's biggest corporate telecommunications giants.
Like massive state-aligned charities, right?
Right. So you've got this awkward, incredibly tense, ideologically explosive room, but that room is the exact birthplace of the modern youth safety net that we see today.
It's, it's such a fascinating collision of worlds.
Totally. So we are exploring a really fascinating, massive stack of digital logs today between a user and an AI named Coco.
Which are just incredibly dense.
Oh, super dense. But our mission for this deep dive is ambitious. We're trying to extract a comprehensive map of how Canadian entities, mutual aid networks, and interfaith groups actually function today.
Right, how they support and aid youth.
Specifically, 2S LGBTQI+ and marginalized youth. We're going to look at the actual mechanics of these systems by analyzing these historical sociological AI logs.
And there's a lot of ground to cover.
There is.
Yeah.
But really quickly, before we unpack this, we need to note that our sources today contain politically charged content spanning various ideological spectrums.
Yeah, from radical liberation movements all the way to state-aligned protectionism.
Exactly. And we're not taking any sides or endorsing any of the viewpoints found in these logs. Our goal is simply to impartially report on the ideas and histories contained in the source material so you can fully understand the landscape.
Right. How these systems were built and how they operate right now. And, it is a landscape entirely defined by friction.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you look at the highly structured, professionalized, and frankly massive support systems that exist for youth across Canada today.
They seem entirely institutional.
Yeah. They have boards of directors, federal grants, HR departments. But the foundational question that jumps out from these AI logs is, how do you get from fiercely underground anti-establishment activism in the 1970s to this nationwide state-funded infrastructure of care?
It's definitely not a straight line.
No, not at all. It is a story of necessary and honestly sometimes really painful compromises.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand the mechanics of how a teenager in crisis is caught by the safety net today, we have to travel back. We have to look at the massive paradigm shift in the early 90s.
The sources paint this really vivid picture of what they call a historical bridge.
Right. The moment where the old guard of radical activism literally collided with the new guard of professional peer support.
Right. So if we examine the Canadian queer movement around 1993, the logs describe it as a relatively single, tight-knit, and ideologically cohesive ecosystem.
Operating largely under the Pink Triangle umbrella.
Exactly. Yeah. You had Pink Triangle Services and Pink Triangle Press.
They published those massively influential magazines like Extra and The Body Politic.
Yes, which was really the intellectual and organizational heart of the movement. But the driving philosophy of that 70s and 80s era was rooted in what the logs term intergenerational liberation.
And we really need to dig into what liberation meant to that specific generation because it's a bit jarring for a modern listener.
It really is.
The radical liberation model of that era was heavily focused on the total abolition of age of consent laws. They viewed state protection as inherently oppressive.
That is the crucial context here. The older activists had lived through an era where the state used protection as a Trojan horse.
Like for surveillance and criminalization.
Yeah, and institutionalization. To them, the government had absolutely no business regulating private lives or determining who could associate with whom.
It was a fiercely anti-authoritarian stance.
Completely. They believed that absolute freedom from state interference was the only path to safety.
But by 1993, you see this severe generational fracture happening, right?
Yeah, because the younger organizers, the youth who were actually living on the streets or surviving in hostile high schools, they started to realize something.
That this hands-off radical approach was leaving vulnerable kids completely isolated.
Exactly. Absolute freedom doesn't put a roof over your head when your parents kick you out.
Right. If the state isn't protecting you, and the activists think protection is a dirty word, you fall right through the cracks.
You do. And this brings us to a really pivotal meeting detailed in the COCO logs.
June 1993, right?
Yes. At the 519 Community Center in Toronto, a group of youth organizers, driven by figures like Deb Cowan, gathered to address this exact crisis of isolation.
And out of that room, the lesbian, gay, bi youth line was birthed, which we know today as the LGBT youth line.
Yeah, but this wasn't just, plugging in a new fun line. This was a massive philosophical earthquake.
Because it represented a definitive shift.
Right, from the older 1970s intergenerational liberation models to a modern peer-to-peer protection model.
It was youth stepping up to the microphone and saying, look, we cannot just fight the state.
Yeah, we need to focus on alleviating the crushing isolation of our peers right now. They wanted a safety net, not just a revolution.
But here is the architectural paradox that the logs highlight so well. The youth line didn't start in some pristine corporate office.
No, it was incubated right inside the Radical Pink Triangle offices.
They were physically sharing the space.
They were. The logs detail how this new protection-focused youth group was operating out of the exact same room.
Using the same desks, the same rotary phones.
The same mailing lists as the older activists who had spent decades fighting against the very concept of protective age laws.
The ideological tension in that room must have been palpable.
Oh, it had to be.
It's wild. You have one side of the desk arguing that the state should abolish all boundaries, and the other side of the desk taking calls from terrified 15-year-olds who desperately need boundaries and safe spaces.
But the youth organizers knew that to survive as a legitimate social service,
You actually be allowed to help kids without being shut down by the authorities.
exactly, they needed credibility outside of that radical bubble. They needed a shield.
And that shield came in the form of Kids Help Phone, or KHP.
Right. Now, Kids Help Phone had launched a few years earlier, in May 1989.
But unlike the grassroots movements, KHP was born with massive corporate backing.
Yeah, from companies like Bell Canada. They were polished. They had pediatricians and child psychologists on their boards.
They acted as the state-aligned establishment.
They did. And in May 1994, Kids Help Phone officially, publicly endorsed the launch of the Youth Line.
I really have to pause on this because the mechanics of this alliance are just fascinating.
It's quite the strategic move.
It's like a grassroots punk band who plays in illegal underground venues suddenly getting sponsored by a massive corporate bank just so they can pay the rent and keep the venue open for kids who need a safe place to sleep.
That's actually a great way to look at it.
You have the ultimate anti-establishment activists bridging with the ultimate corporate state entity.
The analogy holds up because it highlights the sheer pragmatism of the move. The logs outline the friction and the deep synergy of this exact moment.
Because Kids Help Phone provided the seal of approval.
Right. By endorsing the Youth Line, they essentially told the Canadian government, the school boards, and terrifying entities like the Children's Aid Society, hey, these youth organizers are legitimate. Do not shut them down.
But on the flip side, Kids Help Phone desperately needed the Youth Line too.
They did. KHP was receiving calls from queer youth, but their mainstream, highly clinical operators simply weren't equipped.
They didn't have the lived experience or the cultural competency to help them effectively at that time.
Exactly. It was a strategic, almost ruthless handshake.
They probably fundamentally disagreed on the politics of how the world should work. But they absolutely needed each other to function in the present reality.
Yeah, they had to deal with the reality on the ground.
And for you listening, I want you to think about how often vital social services, the ones we just assume have always been there, start from these incredibly uncomfortable compromises.
It happens more often than people realize.
You have radical, uncompromising ideas crashing into slow, corporate state institutions. And somehow, out of that friction, a lifeline is born.
It is the ultimate lesson in the pragmatism of survival. The organizers of the Youth Line recognize that ideological purity doesn't save lives. navigating the reality of the bureaucratic world does.
Which is such a powerful takeaway.
And that 1994 bridge fundamentally altered the trajectory of youth support in Canada. It proved that marginalized communities could build structured, professionalized systems of care that the state would recognize.
Which perfectly sets up the next major phase of our deep dive.
Right, moving into the modern era.
Yeah. We know how the blueprint was drafted in 1994, but how did that single shared rotary phone in a community center explode into the massive multi-tiered infrastructure of youth support we see across Canada today?
Because it really is massive now.
Oh, the sheer scale and the intricate mechanics of the modern support network are staggering in these logs. We aren't just talking about hotlines anymore.
No, we are talking about physical, legal, and educational fortresses.
Fortresses is a good word for it.
What's fascinating here is that the sources map out a vast, tangible network of Canadian entities dedicated to 2S LGBTQI+ youth. And what is most revealing is how the logs categorize this infrastructure.
Right, they don't just list organizations randomly.
Exactly. They group them by functional mechanics into three main pillars.
Crisis and mental health, housing and shelter, and school and education.
Yes. This division of labor is entirely intentional.
Let's avoid drowning in a soup of acronyms and instead look at how these pillars actually function, starting with the first one, crisis and mental health. This is the emergency response layer, right?
Yes. Kids Help Phone and the LGBT Youth Line are the direct descendants of that 1994 bridge, but their mechanics have evolved significantly.
They operate with nationwide reach now.
Right, offering confidential text, chat, and phone support. When a youth is in an active state of panic, perhaps they've just been outed, or they are experiencing a severe mental health episode.
This is the first net that catches them.
Exactly. They provide immediate, real-time de-escalation.
But the logs emphasize a brutal reality here. You could de-escalate a panic attack over a text message, but you can't text a teenager a safe place to sleep.
You really can't.
Once the immediate crisis is stabilized, you hit the second pillar, which is housing. The sources note that the rate of homelessness among queer and marginalized youth is disproportionately high.
Almost entirely due to family rejection.
Right. And this is where the infrastructure moves from digital to physical.
The housing entities detailed in the sources are engaged in what they term survival and stabilization.
Survival and stabilization.
Yeah. And we have to look closely at how these places operate because they are not just standard city homeless shelters.
Because standard shelters can often be incredibly dangerous or exclusionary for trans or queer youth.
Right, so the community had to build their own. The logs point heavily to places like Friends of Ruby in Toronto.
Let's look at how that actually works. It's a custom-built, 2S LGBTQI-specific transitional home, right?
It is, and what makes a place like Friends of Ruby structurally different is the integration of services.
So it's not just a bed for the night.
No, it is not just providing a cot in a crowded gymnasium for 12 hours. It features integrated mental health care, life skills training, and long-term stabilization plans.
It's designed to pull a youth entirely out of that survival mode mindset.
Exactly. Then you have the Gale Center, also in Toronto, providing similar emergency and transitional housing with a focus on intensive case management.
The logs also detail how the 519 Community Center operates Aura hostels.
Right, which offers intensive case management alongside emergency shelter beds.
And this infrastructure stretches across the country. Like in the prairies, you have 80 Saskatoon operating Pride Home.
Now, Pride Home is really fascinating because it's a long-term group home.
It is architecturally designed for 2S LGBTQ youth to live in a safe, affirming environment.
Sometimes for years, until they are ready to transition to independent adulthood.
The strategic division of labor here is just critical to understand. So if the crisis lines are the emergency room, these housing projects are the long-term rehab centers.
That's a great analogy. They do the slow, expensive work of rebuilding a life. They provide the meal programs, the secure doors, and the physical safety for youth who have been forcibly removed from their primary family structure.
They are the heavy load bearers of the entire ecosystem.
They really are.
But then we have the third pillar, which is school and education. If we stick with the medical analogy, this has to be the preventative medicine.
Or maybe the structural engineering of the whole system. Preventative engineering is an excellent way to frame it.
Yeah, because the school-based entities exist to ensure that youth do not end up needing the emergency room or the rehab center in the first place.
Right. Their mechanics are focused on proactive inclusion and legal protection so that youth aren't bullied into a crisis or rejected by their communities.
So how do they actually do that on the ground? The logs detail a few major players here.
They do it through curriculum and training. The Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, for example.
The CCGSD.
Yeah. They provide intensive training for gender sexuality alliances, or GSAs, across the country. They go into schools and teach students and teachers how to architect safe spaces within the hallways.
And then there's SOGI 123, which operates heavily in British Columbia and Alberta.
Right, they provide actual curriculum resources. They give teachers the lesson plans and the vocabulary needed to make their classrooms inclusive.
Normalizing these concepts for all students, not just the queer ones.
Exactly. And for when the preventative education fails, there are legal safety nets.
Right. The sources mention justice for children and youth.
Yes, providing actual legal representation and advice for students who are facing systemic discrimination from their own school boards.
Wow, actual lawyers stepping in.
Yeah. We also see regional support systems acting as the mortar that holds these three pillars together.
Like QMunity in British Columbia.
Right, they run social groups like Gab Youth and counseling to build peer networks.
And the Youth Project in Nova Scotia does incredible province-wide advocacy, literally driving across the province to connect rural youth with housing referrals.
Then you have Project 10 in Montreal, focusing specifically on the mental well-being of youth aged 14 to 25.
And the Rainbow Resource Center covering immense ground across Manitoba.
It's an incredibly intricate web.
It is. But when you map it out like this, emergency lines, physical housing, and preventative schooling, you really start to see the terrifying fragility of the ecosystem.
Oh, absolutely. Everything is connected through a chain of causality.
Right. If one pillar fails, let's say a provincial government decides to roll back school safety policies and ban GSAs.
The educational pillar crumbles.
And the immediate mechanical result is a flood into the other pillars.
Yes. If you remove the preventative education in the schools, bullying and isolation skyrocket.
Suddenly, the crisis text lines are overwhelmed with suicidal ideation.
And the transitional housing shelters run out of beds because more kids are being rejected by families who are consuming hostile rhetoric.
The system relies entirely on all three pillars holding their weight.
It's a delicate balance.
But reading through these COCO logs, there's a fascinating pivot. Because providing a warm bed, a legal advocate, and a safe classroom is vital.
But it's really only treating the physical symptoms of a much deeper, more insidious societal rejection.
Exactly. How do these organizations help a teenager who is sitting in that safe, transitional housing bed, but is struggling spiritually?
A kid who is wrestling existentially with their identity.
Yeah. This is where the source material transitions from physical infrastructure to the emotional and spiritual infrastructure.
And it is arguably the most complex work being done. The logs highlight a pervasive, crushing struggle for these youth.
The deep-seated feeling of being fundamentally broken.
Yes. The sources trace this feeling back to what they label the Western medical perspective.
Okay, let's break down what that actually means in this context.
The logs define the Western medical perspective as a narrative, often heavily intertwined with conservative, Christian-centric cultural views that frames a queer or trans youth as having been born in the wrong body.
Or that their identity is a biological glitch.
Right. A psychological error or a medical mistake that needs to be diagnosed, pathologized, and ultimately fixed.
So if you are a youth growing up in a household that believes this, you aren't just a kid trying to figure yourself out.
No, you are a medical problem causing your family distress. You are a walking diagnosis.
And this is where the interfaith and cultural groups detailed in the logs step in to completely dismantle that framework.
They don't just offer support, they offer a total reframing of reality.
They introduce a paradigm shift.
They teach identity fluidity not as a glitch, but as an inherent asset.
The logs use this incredibly powerful phrase to describe how these groups reframe queer identity. They call it a gift to the proper collective.
A gift to the proper collective. That is a massive conceptual leap from medical mistake.
It really is. And to achieve this leap, the sources mention a concept called causal therapy.
Right.
Okay, so causal therapy. If I'm reading these logs about the 1930s socialist medical texts, right, it implies that if a houseplant is dying, you don't diagnose the leaves with a disease and try to paint them green.
No, you look at the soil, you look at the sunlight.
Right. So applied to this modern context, these interfaith groups are basically trying to change the family soil rather than curing the kid.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Not just the soil, but the entire climate of the house.
The tests argued that you don't cure social ills by putting people in a penitentiary or a hospital ward.
You fix the environment that is causing the distress. So these interfaith groups practice causal therapy by refusing to treat the youth as the patient.
Because the youth is fine.
Exactly. The environment, specifically the rigid mindset of the parents and the exclusionary doctrine of their faith communities, is what is diseased.
They prioritize connection over conformity. Here's where it gets really interesting. In popular culture, religion is almost universally portrayed as the primary antagonist for queer youth.
It's often seen as the source of the trauma.
Yeah. But in these logs, we see interfaith groups being deployed as the exact, precise, mechanistic tool to save these families and keep them together.
It completely flips the script. It uses the language of faith to heal the wounds inflicted by faith.
Let's look at the mechanics of the specific groups the sources analyze. You have affirming connections in Alberta.
Right. They don't just tell queer kids to leave their churches.
No, they work directly inside faith communities to amplify inclusive theological voices.
Helping individuals beautifully merge their queer identity with their spiritual identity.
And then there's Salam Canada. The logs detail how they act as an incredible resource supporting multicultural families.
Specifically Muslim and queer or trans youth.
Right. They create spaces where youth doesn't have to choose between their gender identity and their cultural heritage or their family's traditions.
They celebrate the intersection of those diverse experiences.
We also see targeted interventions for the parents themselves, right?
Yes. The logs mention the Loving Our LGBTQ plus kids group.
This is a Zoom-based group specifically engineered for parents from Christian backgrounds.
Parents who are trying to navigate unwelcoming conservative church cultures.
They are provided a space to process their own religious panic without inflicting it on their children.
Which is so crucial, and organizations like Flag Canada and Families in Transition, or FIT-T, operate on similar mechanics.
They provide peer-to-peer support for parents.
It's literally parents who have successfully navigated this transition talking to terrified parents who are just starting it.
Helping them mechanically move away from fear-based reactions toward unconditional love.
And we must deeply examine the indigenous and two-spirit resurgence movements highlighted in the logs.
Because they are practicing the most profound form of causal therapy.
Yes. Organizations like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, or NYSHN, and the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society.
They are not reacting to the Western medical perspective.
No, they are entirely bypassing it by reclaiming ancient traditional roles.
Right, because long before colonial powers arrived with their medical textbooks and their binary gender definitions, fluidity was already a respected structural part of the social fabric.
In many of these indigenous cultures, two-spirit individuals weren't marginalized.
They were revered as holding specific, vital, ceremonial, and social roles within the community.
Exactly. By reconnecting a youth with that history, these organizations completely dismantle the narrative of being a glitch.
They provide historical proof that the youth is, in fact, a cultural gift.
It makes you reflect on the sheer mechanical power of vocabulary.
It really does. Because if a family is locked in a cycle of screaming arguments because the parents view their child as a medical problem that actively contradicts their religious faith.
The entire household is a war zone.
Yeah. But if an interfaith group can step in and shift that vocabulary, if they can help the parents see their child identity as a cultural gift, or a complex spiritual journey ordained by their creator.
It literally changes the temperature of the room. It can save the relationship.
It fundamentally removes the youth from the exhausting defensive position of constantly having to justify their own existence against a rigid doctrine.
Instead, it places the burden of growth on the parents, inviting them to expand their understanding of their own faith.
That is the triumph of causal therapy.
It really is.
Okay, so we've established the foundation. We have youth who have secured physical safety in transitional housing.
They have legal backing in their schools.
And their spiritual and emotional identities have been affirmed by these community groups. So what happens next?
Because the sources are very clear on this. These youth do not just sit around being passive recipients of charity.
No, they evolve. They become what the AI logs specifically refer to as architects.
This is the most dynamic shift in the logs. The narrative moves from youth being supported by institutions to youth actively building systems to support each other.
The logs describe their methodology using a fascinating sociological concept, asymmetric architectural design.
Asymmetric architectural design.
It sounds like a buzzword a tech startup would use to secure venture capital.
It kind of does, yeah. But in this context, it's actually a grassroots survival strategy.
It is a profound strategy of resistance. Let's break down the mechanics.
The core idea is that massive institutions, whether it's the federal government, which the logs often refer to as the crown,
Or a massive bureaucratic school board.
right, these institutions are structurally symmetrical. They are rigid, they are slow-moving.
They rely on intense hierarchy, endless paperwork, and official permissions.
They have funding and formal power, but they cannot adapt quickly to a crisis.
They are the Titanic. Massive, powerful, but it takes them miles to turn the ship.
Precisely. Youth collectives, on the other hand, operate asymmetrically.
They are fluid, fast, decentralized, and highly adaptable.
They don't have board meetings to decide if someone is hungry.
They use what the logs call radical solidarity.
They deploy open-source tools like secure group chats on Signal or heavily moderated Discord servers.
To build entire support networks that exist completely outside of state surveillance or the oversight of their high school principals.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this asymmetric building is described in the historical theories as constructing a caracol, or a utopian commons.
The utopian commons.
The youth are not standing outside the principal's office holding a protest sign asking for permission to be treated fairly.
They're actively creating their own parallel worlds.
They are building a shadow infrastructure of care that operates alongside, and often in spite of, the formal rules of society.
Okay, wait, let me push back on the grandiosity of this terminology for a second.
Sure.
When we use massive terms like shadow infrastructure and asymmetric architectural design,
Yeah.
aren't we basically just talking about teenagers starting highly organized group chats and clubhouses because the adults in their lives are failing them?
At its most foundational, granular level, yes. It is teenagers in group chats.
Right.
But the scale, the speed, and the life-saving mechanics of that organization elevate it far beyond a simple clubhouse.
It is a deliberate, tactical rejection of what the logs call the institutional penitentiary mindset.
Exactly. The belief that every action a youth takes must be supervised, permitted, and regulated by an adult authority figure.
Okay, I see. So how does this actually look in practice? The sources dive into the mutual aid networks as a prime example, right?
Yes. Mutual aid is the purest form of the utopian commons,
The logs detail groups like the People's Pantry in Toronto.
which is run entirely by volunteers providing home-cooked meals and groceries to those facing food insecurity.
You have Maggie's Toronto and Access Alliance.
These networks do not operate as charities, where a rich benefactor gives to a poor recipient. They operate mechanically as a gift economy.
Right, it's neighbors sharing resources directly with neighbors so no one falls through the cracks. It's horizontal, not vertical.
Exactly. If the state welfare system demands 6 weeks of paperwork and 3 forms of ID to help a 17-year-old who just got kicked out of their house,
That kid's gonna freeze on the street.
yes. But a mutual aid pod on Discord.
Someone posted they need a couch, and within 12 minutes, 3 people have offered a safe place to sleep.
And someone else has e-transferred them $20 for a bus ticket.
The mutual aid pod steps in immediately, bypassing the slow bureaucracy entirely.
That speed is the asymmetric advantage. And this philosophy extends far beyond emergency housing or food.
It changes how they train, educate, and socialize each other, too.
The logs detail how youth are actively bypassing traditional hierarchical drill sergeant-style summer camps.
Like military cadets or traditional scouting.
Right, in favor of immersive, community-led retreats.
The alternative training hubs. The sources list some incredible programs here,
The Indigenous Perspective Society offers a course called Coming In.
which focuses heavily on the mechanics of Two-Spirit resurgence and decolonial thought.
In Ottawa, there's the 10 Oaks Project, providing completely inclusive, radical summer camps.
You have Machine Lev, which is a pluralistic Jewish leadership camp for queer youth.
And out in West, you have massive gatherings like Camp Aurora in Manitoba and Camp Firefly in Alberta.
We have to look at how these camps function mechanically. They are physical, temporary manifestations of the utopian commons.
They are spaces where youth learn leadership, not through obedience to a single, unquestioned adult leader,
But through peer-to-peer mentorship, radical honesty, and collaborative problem solving.
they are actively practicing the world they want to live in.
And when the week is over and they return to their separate cities, they don't just lose that connection.
No, they use digital inroads to maintain that commons year-round,
The logs mentioned the GLOM app, which was presented by It Gets Better Canada.
providing mental health and empowerment tools directly into the pockets of students.
You have organizations like Love Intersections in Vancouver using digital storytelling and documentary filmmaking to address complex systemic racism and intersectional identities online.
So this peer bond, forged at a camp and maintained on a Discord server, becomes the ultimate unbreakable safety net.
Let's run a hypothetical based on these mechanics. Say a student is isolated by a strict, discriminatory policy at their rural high school.
The school administration is hostile. The symmetrical formal system has failed them.
Right. But because of this asymmetric design, their GSA, their gender sexuality alliance, or their mutual aid pod online instantly steps in.
They provide the legal resources from JFCY.
They provide emotional support. They provide a workaround.
They have effectively made the rigid rules of the principal's office entirely irrelevant to their survival.
They're practicing what sociologists call systemic non-recognition.
They don't waste their energy fighting the brick wall of bureaucracy. They simply pool together and flow around it like water.
It is incredibly effective. However, as brilliant and adaptable as this asymmetric design is, there is a fundamental, unavoidable friction that the AI logs eventually confront head-on.
The one thing a Discord server cannot generate out of thin air.
The money.
The money. Building apps, running province-wide summer camps, securing physical leases for transitional housing.
Buying the groceries to distribute through mutual aid.
It requires hard, tangible capital. Where does a decentralized, youth-led, anti-establishment movement get the funding to survive in a capitalist system?
Which brings us to our final segment, Funding the Future. We are examining the gritty mechanics of survival.
How do these youth entities navigate the ultimate ethical friction of taking government and corporate money to fund their radical, independent support systems?
The sources outline several major funding arteries that keep this ecosystem alive. First, you have the massive federal inroads.
The logs point to Women and Gender Equality Canada, or WAGE, which leads the federal 2S LGBTQI+ action plan.
You also have significant blocks of funding flowing from Canadian Heritage, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada.
CIRNAC, yeah.
So the state, the very entity that the youth collectives are trying to build an alternative to, is offering up the cash.
And the logs detail a very specific, fascinating bureaucratic pathway called the Stream 2 Blueprint.
The government essentially offers up to $25,000 in grants for unincorporated grassroots youth groups to become legal, incorporated entities.
This Stream 2 funding is a crucial pivot point in the logs.
The youth collective take this 25 grand and they use it strategically.
They use it to pay Indigenous elders for their time and wisdom. They use it to build secure digital toolkits, and they use it to formally incorporate so they can sign leases.
But there is a massive, uncomfortable ethical tension here.
There is. The AI logs actually refer to this dynamic as the liability exchange.
The language used in the sources is quite striking here. The radical factions within the logs bluntly refer to this state or corporate funding as blood money.
Money derived from the very colonial and capitalist systems that have historically marginalized them.
Systems that the youth collectives are fundamentally opposed to.
So the analytical question becomes, how do they justify taking the money? If you believe the crown is inherently oppressive, how do you cash a check from the crown?
So, what does this all mean? The logs explain it mechanically as a form of economic repatriation.
Right.
Analogy time, because this is the only way I can wrap my head around it.
Let's hear it.
It's like a group of tenants who realize their landlord is extracting all their wealth while refusing to fix the heating.
Okay.
So, the tenants form a union. They figure out a way to legally access the landlord's own mandated maintenance budget, and they use that exact money to slowly, quietly buy the apartment building out from under him.
They use the landlord's cash so the tenants can eventually own the building cooperatively.
Yes.
That is precisely the mechanical logic the youth collectives apply to federal and corporate grants.
They view taking the funding not as selling out to the state, but as using the state's extracted resources to fund their own causal therapy.
They are taking the capital to build a robust infrastructure, a utopian commons, that will ultimately reduce their reliance on the state entirely.
They're reclaiming the resources to build their own independence.
And if a youth group decides that the domestic political strings attached to Canadian federal money are just too restrictive,
The logs show they've built workarounds for that too.
they use transnational funding. They look globally to bypass the national state entirely.
Yes, the logs detail how organizations tap into international philanthropic networks.
They secure funding from the International Trans Fund, the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice in the United States, and the Sigrid Rousing Trust in the UK.
This global strategy allows Canadian grassroots groups to bypass restrictive national policies or conservative provincial governments.
Funding their operations with international money that doesn't care about local political squabbles.
Furthermore, they are forming massive tech and corporate partnerships,
Queer tech receives federal funding to address systemic barriers within the tech ecosystem.
ensuring queer youth have access to high-paying jobs and digital skills.
Corporate giants like H&M provide grants for indigenous youth routes to fund social enterprise projects.
And you have the Indigenous Innovation Initiative providing massive seed funding, up to $250,000, for bold, systemic projects led by Two-Spirit and trans persons.
It's a highly pragmatic, deeply sophisticated behind-the-scenes navigation of bureaucracy.
These youth aren't just activists. They are grant writers, legal strategists, and financial planners.
And it's a great reminder for you, the listener, that every single major social safety net you see in the world today,
Every shelter, every hotline, every community center.
it all requires this kind of gritty administrative navigation to survive.
You can have the most radical, beautiful, utopian vision for community care as your head, but at the end of the day, someone still has to sit down at a laptop and fill out the 40-page federal grant application to keep the lights on and buy the groceries.
It is the ultimate marriage of high-minded utopian ideals and grounded practical reality. The youth collectives are using the master's tools not to dismantle the master's house, as the old saying goes, but to quietly, efficiently build a much better, safer house right next door, using the master's budget.
And once it's built, they are inviting everyone to move in.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and recap the incredible journey we've been on through these dense cocoa logs.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started at the historical bridge of 1994, inside a dingy office where the radical Pink Triangle activists shared a rotary phone with the new protectionist youth line.
Who were quietly validated by the corporate power of Kids Help Phone.
We mapped out how that single phone line evolved into a massive modern physical infrastructure.
The emergency crisis lines catching kids as they fall.
The custom-built transitional housing like Friends of Ruby, doing the slow work of rehabilitation.
And the preventative school programs engineering a safer environment.
We then explored the deep philosophical spiritual infrastructure. We analyzed how interfaith and indigenous groups actively dismantle the Western medical perspective.
Shifting the vocabulary from medical glitch to cultural gift, to practice causal therapy and heal entire families.
We witnessed the mechanics of asymmetric architectural design.
Seeing how youth bypass slow, rigid institutions to act as architects of their own utopian commons through mutual aid pods and alternative summer camps.
And finally, we uncovered the complex reality of the liability exchange, how they pragmatically fund this liberation using state, transnational, and corporate grants.
It's an incredibly complex, resilient web of support that has evolved so rapidly over just a few decades.
It really is. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Throughout our analysis of these logs, we kept returning to the brilliance of that 1937 socialist medical concept, causal therapy.
The fundamental idea that you do not punish or pathologize the individual, you fix the environment.
The Canadian youth support systems are slowly, painfully, but successfully realizing that we need to change the environment rather than trying to fix the kids.
So the provocative thought for you to explore in your own life is this. What penitentiary mindsets or rigid, outdated rules are you upholding?
Think about your own workplace, your family dynamics, or your daily life.
Where are you expending all your energy trying to fix a person when what you really need to be doing is redesigning the room?
It is a profound shift in perspective. When you stop asking what is wrong with you and start asking what is wrong with the space we are in, radical change becomes possible.
It all comes back to how we view each other. Human identity and community care aren't simple. They aren't a clean, easily diagnosed problem.
It's a messy, beautifully complex web of compromises, shared resources, friction, and faith.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. Keep questioning the blueprints of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.